Hello class, it's Professor Gavor. Is a presentation of the chapter 3 of our textbook talking about demand and supply. We're really starting to get into the microeconomics topics now. Usually I don't spend a lot of time on these preamble slides, but they're there if you want to look at them. This first slide, we talk about organic vegetables and fruits. And they're usually sold in the geographic region in which they're grown, even though I think the industry has gotten to the point where they can deliver them all over the country. In theory, they should cost less because there's less transportation and probably less fertilizer. They use more natural fertilizers that might be cheaper, but they charge more for them. So that's not usually the case. So this is caused by supply and demand, or expectation of what it should cost. So organic fruits and vegetables actually cost more. If we look at the topics at hand, demand, it's the amount of some good or service consumers are willing and able to purchase at a price. The example, a standard cup of Starbucks drip coffee sells for around $2. People are buying it at a certain volume. If they were to charge $10 for it, people would buy a lot less. If they were charged 50 cents for it on a promotion, people would buy a lot more. How many more people would buy it? How many less people would buy it given the price? Well, you have the revenue equation. Price times quantity. So maybe the revenue goes up, maybe the revenue goes down, and that's the whole issue of where you set the price at, and whether it will affect your revenue positively or negatively. That's why microeconomics is called sometimes price theory. Price, what the buyer pays for a unit of a specific good or service. Quantity demanded is the total number of goods that will be sold. So there's this law of demand, keeping all other variables that affect demand constant. If price goes up, then demand goes down. If price goes down, then demand goes up. For most normal goods, and we'll define what normal good means later, this is the case. For some luxury goods, the higher you charge creates a premium, and maybe the more you sell. If you charge $1,000 for a purse, you may get some buyers. But if you charge $2,000, you may get more people to buy it because it has a cachet of being exclusive. A demand schedule is a table that shows the range of prices for a certain good or service and the quantity demanded at each price. So that's a tabular form. Think of an Excel spreadsheet. The curve is a graph of the same. So let's take a picture of what a curve looks like. You could find the demand schedule for this curve in your textbook. So this is for millions of gallons of gasoline, the quantity. And as you notice, the quantity is always the x-axis, the price is always the y-axis, and the demand curve is downward sloping as you read from left to right. So at $2.20 per gallon, they're going to sell 420 million gallons of gas. At $1 per gallon, they're going to sell 800 million gallons of gas. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but it's just there to illustrate it. On the other side, it's people that make the goods and services. How much are they willing to sell or provide at a given price? So supply is the amount of some good or service a producer is willing to supply at each price point. The quantity supplied is the total number of units of a good or service producers is willing to sell at a given price. So if we think of our Starbucks example, Starbucks is selling whatever number of grande drip coffees at $2 a cup for 16 ounces. But at 50 cents a cup, they're less likely to want to offer very much because their profit margin is going to be low. They might do it for a short period of time as a promotion, but on an ongoing basis, they probably would not want to offer too many cups of coffee at that price. Yet, at $10 a cup, they would sell every cup they could possibly make. And that would be something they would want to do. They would, if at $10 a cup, we'll sell you every $10 cup of coffee you want to buy. So the law of supply is a little bit different than the law of demand. All things being the same, all other things that affect the supply being constant, if the price goes up, the supply goes up. If the price goes down, then the supply goes down. Notice that demand, price, and supply go in opposite directions. When it comes to supply, they go in the same direction. Much like the demand curve and schedule, there's a supply schedule and a supply curve. If we look at that same gasoline and price graph, but we look at it from the supply side, we see an increasing demand curve. At $1 a gallon, the producers are only willing to make 500 million gallons of gas available to the consumers. Yet at $2.20 per gallon, they're willing to produce and make available to consumers 720 million gallons. So the supply curve, S, the demand curve being D, is created by graphing the points from a supply schedule. It has an upward slope, and you can notice that the law of supply holds. At the lower price, they're willing to sell less. The quantity they're willing to offer is less than when the price is higher. So we have an increasing slope as you read from left to right. Now, when you put them both together, we have this concept of equilibrium, where quantity demand equals quantity supplied. So we have a combination of price and quantity for demand and a combination of price and quantity for supply. Where those two curves cross each other, there's no economic pressure from surpluses or shortages, and we'll define that would cause the price or quantity to change. So when we reach that equilibrium point where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, the price at that point is when you have the quantity and price of both the demand curve and the supply curve are the same. That's called the equilibrium price. The equilibrium quantity is the quantities, obviously, for that point. When you're above that price, supply will be bigger than demand. You will have a surplus of goods available for people to buy. Because you have a surplus of goods and not enough people are buying them at that price, most manufacturers, producers, sellers have an incentive to lower the price to move the goods that aren't moving. So the price usually drops towards the equilibrium point. If the price is set below the equilibrium point, you have a shortage. The demand is higher than the producer's willingness or the supplier's willingness to produce the goods or services at that price. So now there's pressure. There's more demand than there is supply. There's pressure to raise that. Raise the price, and it approaches the equilibrium point as well. If you look at the picture, you'll see exactly that's the case. In this millions of gallons of gas example, at $1.80 a gallon, you can see the demand is for 500. The suppliers are willing to make 700 million gallons. So you have more gas than you need. Well, the suppliers then want to sell that gas. And it's not selling at that price, so there's an incentive to lower the price, getting towards the equilibrium so that you use up that gasoline. On the same token, if for some reason they ran a sale price or prices were artificially below, or they're not artificially, but were set below the equilibrium price and quantity, the suppliers at $1.20 only want to provide 550 million gallons, yet the people that buy the gasoline at that price are willing to buy 700 million gallons. So the demand here is bigger than the supply. Now there's pressure for the suppliers to produce more, and there's pressure for the price to go up. Is why they'll do that. The example I use in class oftentimes for supply and demand is tickets being scalped at a Cubs game. Probably if the Cubs are playing Cincinnati, a team that's not too good, you're going to be up in this area. You can't, if the equilibrium price, let's say, is the ticket value, just for argument's sake, it doesn't necessarily have to be true. But for every game, it's going to change because of the two competitors. So maybe here's the ticket value price if you look at it. Cincinnati. The supply of available tickets is high, the demand for the tickets is low. There's real pressure on the people that are trying to sell tickets. They have to lower the price if they want to sell the tickets. On the other hand, let's say it's a big rivalry game like the Cubs versus St. Louis. In that case, maybe the equilibrium price is somewhere higher than the ticket price. And if we have this line then as a ticket price, the demand is way higher than the amount of available tickets. So you have an excess demand or shortage of tickets. So all of a sudden people are seeing this and they're saying, well, I can watch a game at home on TV. Why don't I sell my tickets? But I want to sell them at a higher price, maybe twice face value, something of that nature. All of a sudden people that were bound and determined to go to the game might be willing to watch it in the confines of their home, as opposed to the friendly confines of Wrigley. So that's a summary of that. When we say all other things being equal, the law of demand, law of supply pertains when all other things affecting price or demand or supply being equal. There's a term in economics that comes from Latin. It's called Ceteris paribus. Ceteris like et cetera, paribus. So Ceteris paribus means all other things being equal. So any given demand curve or supply curve is based on the Ceteris paribus assumption that everything else is held equal. So the only thing we're worrying about is price affecting the quantity. We're not worrying about the mood. Like right now, we have supply and demand for gasoline. Well, no one's buying gasoline today because when I'm recording this, the temperature is, we're in a polar vortex and the temperature is, like minus 15 degrees where I'm sitting. So no one's out buying gasoline. So that's going to change the dynamics of the quantity sold today. But gas stations are not going to change the price today for that. But tomorrow we should be back to normal and gasoline will sell at whatever price. So weather like this might be, just one day here or there would be a ceteris paribus. All things equal, the price doesn't change. The quantities don't change too much. So the demand curve is used to identify how consumers would buy at a given price. You set a price, you say that's the quantity people would buy. Sometimes you know this is demand, sometimes you don't. Sometimes we use it conceptually, sometimes we actually have the actual data for it. So if we raise the price, we know where the quantity is going to change. If, for all possible combinations, you make the revenue, you can decide where your revenue is maximized. And if the only thing you're going by is the demand curve, you'd probably want to set the price where your revenue is maximized. So this is a change in quantity demanded. A shift of the demand curve, a shift in the quantity demanded, means that the curve actually moves. Something has happened in the ceteris paribus world that has made the demand shift up in this case. If the demand was over here, it would have shifted down. So something happened to make a change in demand. Usually the curve is parallel to the original curve. So here's one. Again, we're talking about quantity or price. This is not necessarily the gallons of gasoline anymore, but here's the original demand curve, usually D sub 0. D1 is an increase in demand, D2 is a decrease in demand. The idiotic example I use in class sometimes is hot dogs. There's a price for hot dogs, and there's a quantity for hot dogs, and you have a demand curve. Let's say the government came out tomorrow and said hot dogs are the single greatest health food that anyone could possibly ever eat. Our demand for hot dogs wouldn't increase along the same curve. The entire curve, we'd have a new curve to operate on because all of a sudden people that never ate hot dogs, the demand is going to shift. We're going to have a shift of the demand curve up. On the other hand, if the government came out tomorrow and said, we have no idea what's in hot dogs, and we're pretty certain on whatever test we've done that it has a horrible health risk if you eat them on a regular basis, the demand for hot dogs is actually going to go down. It's going to shift downward. Same thing happens to oranges. You might have a normal demand curve that's the average of the past 5 years. But if you all of a sudden have a frost at the exact wrong time of the year where it affects the blossoms, so the number of oranges you get is less, that frost causes the demand curve to shift down. Or that would cause the supply curve to shift down. It would cause the demand curve, probably would stay the same. That was a silly example. Yes, I'm at home and the phone is ringing.
Call from Mardogan Mary.
Sorry about that. It was my mother-in-law. So she's part of the video now. Well, that interrupted the horrible example I just gave about oranges. Let's stick with the hot dog demand. That's better for this. So what factors affect demand? A shift in demand happens when a change in some economic factor other than price causes a different quantity demanded at every price. Sometimes income causes that. If the economy gets better, people will buy more stuff. And maybe stuff that they weren't buying, they would buy. Like maybe during the Great Recession, champagne sales were horrible. And if you're celebrating, you might buy some cheap wine instead, or maybe not even have a toast. But the economy gets better and you want to celebrate a little bit for something, a birthday, a wedding, a this, that, the other thing, you buy some champagne. So the whole demand curve for champagne could shift up based on income, or when people think their income is more secure. Changing preference and tastes. Think about sodas in the vending machines at North Park. There are almost, it's much harder to find carbonated sugared beverages than it is to find non-carbonated, no sugar added beverages in the vending machines anymore. That's a change in taste and preference. So if I'm doing carbonated beverages, the demand has shifted down. The whole curve has shifted. Changes in the composition of the population. As the population shifts older, younger, foods that appeal to older people, younger people are going to change the demand curve. Price of a substitute or complement changes. If the price of coffee skyrockets, people are going to substitute it with tea if the price of tea hasn't changed. If the price of hot dogs or the demand for hot dogs goes up considerably, well, then the demand for hot dog buns, a complement product, is also going to go up. Ice cream, chocolate sauce, all those kinds of things. Changes in expectations about the future. So this could be, during a boom time, everybody thinks everything's great. Spending is a little bit more freely. Demand is probably higher for most goods. And if there's an impending recession and the tone of the economic climate is gloom and doom, people hold on to their cash a little bit more and are less likely to spend. So demand for many products will go down. So here's a summary of that. Why does demand go up? You have all these things. Taste shift to greater popularity. Population likely to buy it increases. Income rises. Price of substitutes rise. Price of complements fall. Future expectations encourage buying. That's what makes the demand curve shift up. What makes it shift down? The same things, but the opposite. So instead of a taste shift to greater popularity, taste shift to less popularity. Population likely to buy rises, population likely to buy drops. And you can just read down the list. I'm not going to read them all for you. So this brings us to this statement right here. What are the types of goods and services? Now these are economic terms. They don't necessarily mean the same thing you might use when just talking with friends or casually over dinner with people. A normal good is a product whose demand rises when income rises and vice versa. It follows the law of demand to a certain degree, but it's income based. An inferior good is a product whose demand falls when income rises and vice versa. So I think about where I used to work, Colgate-Palmolive. Their flagship Big Red Colgate toothpaste, or Colgate Total toothpaste at this point, If you have more money, you tend to buy more of the premium brand of their toothpaste. If people's income falls, they're more likely to look at the value brands. In the case of Colgate, it would be a product called Ultra Bright. Still a very good toothpaste, but it doesn't have all the protections and all of the additives that make Colgate Total a premium toothpaste. So it probably costs half the price of the Ultra Bright would cost half the price of Total. So a normal good, if my income rises, I buy more of it. Filet would be one of those. Wow, if you like steak, filet is really good. But you buy more of it as you have more money because you can afford discretionary income to buy more of it. An inferior good like the Ultra Bright or a skirt steak, which is a lesser cut of meat, is cheaper. So if you're still going to have meat products or beef products, you're not going to buy filet as your income decreases. You're going to buy more skirt steak. So does that make it an inferior good? Does that make it a bad good? No, it's just the economic definition. And be aware of that. It doesn't make it a bad good. It just says when your income falls, you buy more of that good. A substitute is a good or service that can be used in place of another good or service. So if we talk about what's a substitute, coffee and tea are substitutes. Beer and wine could be substitutes for each other. Most of the time we think of food products when we think of substitutes and complements. Complements have to do, they're goods and services that are used together so that the consumption of one good tends to enhance the consumption of the other good. So if the consumption of coffee goes up, probably the consumption of coffee creamers goes up. If the consumption of coffee goes down, the consumption of coffee creamers goes down. Probably the same thing for sweeteners. The same thing applies to the supply curve. And the supply curve can be used to show the minimum price a firm is willing to accept to produce a given quantity. Notice the supply curve is going uphill as you read from left to right. The demand curve went downhill, but the same thing applies. At any given price, we can see how much the suppliers are willing to produce. So when the price goes up, the quantity goes up. When the price goes down, I'm not so willing to offer so much at that lower price because I know I won't be making money. From the suppliers, if you're thinking about a supply curve and this is the only curve around, there's no such thing as a demand curve, well, you're thinking this way. If I make more, if the price goes up, I'm willing to make more. If the price goes down, I'm willing to make less. Very simple. Oftentimes, you look at the cost of production and a desired profit is where accountants want to set the price. But if the demand curve is here, you're going to end up with a surplus, and the price pressure will be downward. If the price is below the demand curve, which is probably unlikely, you're going to have a shortage. So the pressure will be to put the price up, and your desired profit will be higher. So no accountant's going to complain about that. They'll complain if the demand curve is down here, though. So if you have a new higher cost, if the cost of your producing your product goes up and you have the same desired profit, now I got a point that's not on my supply curve anymore for that quantity. Well, guess what? If that's the way you set it, your supply curve is going to have to shift to a new supply curve. So S shifts to S prime. And it's lower because this way is lower. So, but the price will be higher for any given quantity because I have a new higher cost. This is the way accounting looks at things. So if you have a shifting supply curve, your supply curve could go up. And what this means is that any given quantity, you're willing to produce that quantity at a lower price versus a willingness to produce that same quantity at a higher price, depending on what the economic conditions are. So the supply curve can shift due to very many factors. And what are the factors? Natural conditions. Now my orange example makes sense. If I'm producing oranges and I have a supply curve that's kind of the average of the past 5 years, and we have a frost that kills, so all of a sudden at this many oranges, let's say it's 18, who knows what, 1800,000, 18 million oranges, instead of charging $20,000 for that amount of oranges, I want to charge more for it because there's whatever it is, I'm not going to be able to squeeze a production out of it anymore. Probably it shifts this way and this way because they have less. So I want to make the same profit, or I want to get the same revenue for a smaller quantity of oranges. I want to charge more for it. On the other hand, let's say all the conditions were favorable to an unbelievable bumper crop of oranges. Well, now I'm offering a lot more oranges for that same price. So the price per oranges is going to go down. These might not be per units. These might be total quantity of oranges harvested. And you keep the price fixed. So what are the factors that affect this? Shifts in supply occur when there's a change in some economic factor other than price that causes a different quantity to be supplied at every price. Inputs are factors of production, the combination of labor, materials, and machinery that's used to produce the goods and services. And what are the factors? Natural conditions, input prices, technology, government policies. So if you look at the same curve we had for the demand curve, when it shifts upward, the supply curve shifts to the right, favorable natural conditions for production. When it shifts downward, it's opposite, poor natural conditions for production. This has to do with the frost and the oranges I talked about. A fall in input prices. Well, if it costs me less to produce the same amount of goods, in other words, let's say all of a sudden the key component, the CPU of a computer, cost me 2/3 of what it used to cost. For the same price, I'm willing to produce more at every price, so it's going to shift up. Let's say some of the main components of my computer goes the other way. A rise in input prices, well, then it's going to shift backwards. Improved technology makes it shift to the right. A decline in technology, which really is not common, moves the other way. Lower product taxes, less costly regulations, shifts it to the right. More taxes. This is what they tried to do with the sugar tax in Chicago. They wanted to bring the supply curve back so that at the same price, the quantity sold would be much less. So we're going to stop here. This will be part 1, and I'll continue with slide 26 in part 2. Thank you very much.